So my name is Gemma Mahadeo. I am a poet and writer and don't really have that much to do with game development. I mainly have work published in poetry and literature journals. I performed last year at the Queensland Poetry Festival, and I somehow got into the indie game crowd through beer, ironically. Ian MacLarty is the actual game developer, so the proper techno. Sorry, I'm just scrolling. Is a full-time game developer living in Melbourne with an interest in small-scope experimental designs. Most of his games are pay what you want, but he's also released several successful commercial games such as Boson X 2013 and December 2018. His abstract art game, The Catacombs of Solaris 2016, won the 2018 Freeplay Award and has been exhibited around the world. And his most recent release, Jump Grid, received an honourable mention for excellence in design at the 2019 Independent Games Festival. All right, so...
so we start at the beginning?
Yes, we start at the beginning. So Ian and I met because, and started collaborating because I got this commission through Writers Victoria last year for the Women Writers of Colour initiative. And the proposal that I put to them was to write some video game poems inspired by friend and colleague who is in the audience, Alex Bennett. Thank you so much for the idea, because I would never have come up with it otherwise. He curated, as Ian called, Bonfire Park, and I had written a game poem for that. So I thought, yeah, wouldn't that be an awesome idea? I went to RSK, asked them for 3 games that they thought I should play. Played all 3 of them, and then Catacombs of Solaris was actually the first one that they suggested and said, you've got to play this, you've really, really got to play this. And my reaction to playing it was, whoa, this is super, super overwhelming and super, super amazing. There's just like pixels being vomited at you. That was my initial reaction, but it was also really wonderful because as soon as you took your finger off the button, the color palette would change, and so you had to be really careful about when you did that. Yep. So the way I wrote the poem, it's supposed to look like a test pattern. I don't know how many of you remember what it was like in the 80s when there was no signal or TV stations had closed for the night. There'd be that test pattern. So I wrote primary colours, white, black, grey, and then secondary colours, and then I put them in 3 languages. And I basically wanted the reader to feel the disorientation that I initially felt when I first played Catacombs. So that's why it's in 3 languages, so English, French, and Tagalog. And it doesn't matter that you don't understand the words. You're supposed to figure it out for yourself, kind of like how you're supposed to figure out when you play Catacombs that you can change the color palette, and you're not really told how you can do that. You just sort of figure it out for yourself.
So Gemma sent me a copy of the poem, and I really like the way, like the form of the text mimics the shapes that you get in the game. Because the game has got the sort of abstract geometrical shapes in it. And I had been playing around with this idea of doing a text game, and I had a prototype for a program that rendered images as text, but I didn't really know what to do with it. I'll just show you what that was. So this is a kind of, this is just using the webcam to render me as text, but it's just garbled ASCII text, and it's kind of like just a bit of a gimmick. But then, like, seeing Gemma's poem, it kind of made me think, like, very interesting to, instead of just rendering images as random text, actually putting meaningful words behind the object. So maybe having poems written about the objects, actually representing those objects in a space. So I spoke to Gemma about the idea and then made a prototype.
Yep.
And then you were on board with it.
Yes.
And then we sort of just started working on it from there.
Yeah.
And it's been very, very slow. So we just sort of every now and then we'll add a bit to it, which has been a really pleasant experience for me because it's just really low pressure. And it's kind of, we still don't, like, it hasn't, like, sort of taken its true form, like,
yeah.
It's sort of, like, in a state of evolution, so, but I thought it'd be fun to share where it is, so I can show so this is what it is now. So it is a 3D space, but it was important, I thought, I want, it should always look like, every screenshot should always look like a piece of text from that could be out of a page of a book. So the characters should all line up. There's a few sentences where the characters don't quite line up, but that's something I want to fix. But it is actually a 3D space that you can walk around in, and it's very, very hard to navigate, which is kind of the point for me. So, like, so some of these are not, a lot of these things are, so the sky is Gemma's poem, and the ground is Gemma's poem. Some of them are just sort of placeholder things, like shelter is just my placeholder text. So eventually Gemma will put poems to replace all of these structures. And here's a fence, and there's actually a poem on this fence. And if you can see this, it's kind of easy to see if you move around. And Gemma will talk about these poems in more detail, but there's a poem on this fence. You can kind of read bits of it there. And there's a bit about, like, getting a splinter on you when you touch the fence.
Yep.
So you kind of, and there's some tumbleweeds. There's a tumbleweed poem.
Yeah, there it is.
So it's kind of like, so there are written poems there, but it's also a poem generator. It's like sort of randomly combining words together to create these random poems as well. And so you can go inside this. This is a new thing that we just added. Here's a rug, a yellow, brown, green rug.
The ugly 70s chevron rug.
That's right. There's a plastic Christmas tree in the corner. We were thinking about, so BioSK was having a summer Christmas jam.
Yep.
And then we were sort of toying with the idea of, like, maybe this would fit that. So you sort of put some Christmas things in it,
yep.
But we didn't actually end up entering into that. So.
I think they should stay there, though, because they are. It feels sadder that they're discarded and not being used, and they're in a shed. Yeah,
it feels like this space is also sort of discarded, sort of abandoned space.
Yep.
And then there's a piano here now, which.
Yep, a piano in a tin shed that's really, 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 really dilapidated and out of tune.
You can play the piano, but there's no sound. Wait. The sound's gone off.
Oh no.
It was working just now.
That's okay. You don't get to hear how out of tune the piano at my place is.
I'll see if it's the actual. Yeah, there's no sound. Oh, there's sound. Okay. Anyway, this is like sort of what it sounds like.
Yeah.
This is actually Gemma playing. So I don't know why that's not working. Yeah. So yeah, I guess we can have a look. There's a tree. There's some toys at the back here. So I guess I'll talk a bit about the process of making this.
Yep.
And then, yeah. So So there's 3D models in here, and so what the process will be from my side is, I'll make a 3D model, say like a tree or a Christmas tree or something. It's normally something that we've talked about putting into the game, something that usually Gemma will have a poetry idea for the object. And then I'll just make a model in a pre-program called Blender. I'm not very experienced 3D modeler, but the models for this don't have to be very detailed because you're mostly just seeing text anyway. So, and then once I've done that, then when Gemma will send me a poem, and then I'll put it in a little program. So here's all the poems, and they're just in a little text file. And then I have a little script that generates the texture, which is then used in the game to render the scene. And so there's it's not just putting the textures on the objects, because I want the textures to always be, you always see a whole letter, you don't just see half a letter, and I don't want the text to be distorted by the perspective of the scene. This was the kind of solution I came up for rendering the text. But it also means that sometimes like I can't do things that Gemma wants, like, we'll show examples of like...
Yeah, the tumbleweed one is, do you want to show the slide of the tumbleweed? Because that's a really good example. When I initially came up with the idea of having a tumbleweed, so both Ian and I had a similar idea of what this particular landscape generically would look like. So it was going to be sort of fairly dry, arid land, rural, maybe North American, South African inspired. It was also inspired by some time I spent house sitting in Castlemaine at the beginning of last year. And so I sent an email to Ian when I came up with my first tumbleweed poem. There's going to be 3 tumbleweed poems in the game. And that was what I basically wrote text like that, and then asked him, can you put it into the game like that? And he said, unfortunately not. So do you want to show what it actually looks like?
You can kind of see it.
Yeah, there it is, just down there.
It has a round shape. As you probably see, you can kind of see it in the middle. So the middle of the poem it says tumbleweed, and then the words kind of circle around it.
Yep.
Probably see it better in this one. So there. So it's kind of got a circular shape, but it's laid out like mono-space text. Do you want to talk about more of the poems?
Do you want
a little bit more to say?
Yeah. No, you go.
Yeah. So and then place the objects. So basically, and I hook like the model up with the text, and so each model has its own text, and then I have a editor mode. So this is what the actual models look like. So really simple. And I added a really, really primitive editor to the game, so you can put a new thing in the game, and then there's a few things you can do, rotate it and stuff, and scale it, and I can position it around. It's quite cumbersome though, because I can just, if I want to put a different object, I have to like cycle through them to find the one I want, and then I can put it in. So it's kind of, as we start adding more stuff, I might have to make a more sophisticated system for arranging stuff in the game. But it works fine. So, and I kind of didn't want to kind of feels like lo-fi.
Yeah.
Kind of works. So I think that's from my side. That's the sort of way I put it together. But it's more driven by Gemma's poems. I kind of just see it as an anthology of Gemma's poems, but in a novel kind of format.
Yeah, which is interesting because when I initially saw the first build, I can remember thinking, I'm just going to think up all these cool objects that I can imagine would be in this space, and then ask him to put them in. So it kind of felt like I was basically just making it up as I was going along.
Yeah, then I'd like offer resistance, like it's going to be hard.
This is one of the more narrative poems. So this is the fence post poem where I apologise in advance for my writing. This is quite literally just the draft that came out when I was writing about the fence post, and I wanted the reader to feel what it's like when you stroke a fence post, but you stroke it the wrong way and you get splinters in your fingers. That feeling of how it's embedded into your finger, and the bit, I think, where there's a frog that pops out, that's also based on real life. When in Castlemaine I was watering fruit trees and this brown frog popped out from a pipe. I thought it was a snake initially because I am a silly city person. And it was just a frog, just hanging, just really, really digging the water. And so I wrote that into the rest of the poem, sort of at the fence's perimeter. And so that is initially how I envisaged the ugly sort of 70s chevron rug that's probably lying discarded in one of the tin sheds. And I put that in colour just to show, but basically just to showcase how ugly it was. But Ian said that he couldn't put it in those colours, which is fine.
I mean, I probably could have just take a long...
Yeah.
I was lazy, basically.
And plus, it's really, really nasty on the eyes. Like, look at those colours.
But it's also, I think, like, if you have things that are different colours, it kind of makes it easier to tell what's, like, separated geometry, and I kind of like that things are hard to separate. So.
That's more tumbleweed sketches. So I said there's going to be 3 poems. One's going to be probably very more visual poetry again, but I haven't decided what form it's going to take. And then the third one is going to be about a specific species of tumbleweed that roams Australia. So, yeah. And that one's probably going to be a bit more narrative, a bit more like the fence post one. So that's the text for the first tumbleweed poem. And then me trying to lay it out.
Yeah.
And then having an absolute formatting, typing it out onto a Word document is just so hard formatting, and I'm so a stickler for it has to look perfect on the page.
I should probably just get you to use like a programming editor, because that's like what I use, and then the formatting will be probably easier as well for you, because it's like.
I kind of like the work though, because it helps me cement the words in my head as well.
Yep.
And also the space, like the white space for me is really important in poems. So that's it really helps solidify those in my head.
Yeah. And it's actually quite pleasant for me to reformat them, because it kind of because they're very spatial poems, it kind of trying to follow the formatting, kind of it's a nice way to read the poems.
Yeah.
To just relay them out, basically.
Yeah. And this one is the so just random text that came to me, I think probably when I was driving, and then had to pull over and just wrote down something about the rain, because it started raining and properly, excuse my language, pissing down, absolutely just bucketing. And it hadn't rained for a while. So I wrote, that's the rain poem. And then that was the sketches of how I was going to set them out.
So that's in the sky in the game, yeah.
I really like the idea of the rain and the molecules sort of soaking into the earth.
Yeah.
After the earth being so dry, it just sort of, and you know how when you know rain is coming, particularly in humid climates, when rain is coming, you can feel it in the air. It feels really, really different and not as dry. So that was also what I was doing with staggering all the letters around.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I think that's that's pretty much our work in progress. I think we're up to the questions bit, aren't we?
Anyone have questions? Yes, it's definitely not finished. It's just it's a work in progress.
Yeah, it's a work in progress, and we're having an absolute ball working on it. And please ask us questions about it.
Any questions?
There's one up there.
Mine's very easy. I don't need the microphone. Do you have a playable build available?
Ian?
I don't think so, no.
No.
I mean, we have obviously one that we're sharing between each other, but I don't
Yes.
think we want to share it. Yes.
So we genuinely don't know when it's going to be finished. We're just going to keep adding awesome objects into it.
Thank you. This seems so new and different in a way that I've never seen in a game before. I'm sure that you guys probably know more than I do. Do you know if you are like the first of your kind in this type of game? Because I've never seen anything like it before, and I'm curious if you guys have any like inspiration or examples of anything similar that you've seen.
Benjamin Laird, who is a coder, so he's a computer programmer and a poet, and he's actually written an e-chapbook. I think it's called the Durham Poems, so Durham. So if you look that up, and I'll also post a link on the Freeplay hashtag, so that people can look it up. But he's done this thing where you click on a word and you can move the word around and other words follow it. So you can kind of make your own poetic lines. So I saw him speak at the Emerging Writers Festival last year and was really, really inspired by that approach.
Thank you.
I think a lot of us here, of course, come from a gaming background and have some idea how to get started and find other gamers and all that sort of stuff, but have not as much experience in poetry. So I was just wondering if we're looking for poets or want to be poets or want to progress in our poetry, can you give any kind of roadmap for that?
So my dark descent into poetry was actually through music. So I'm a failed musicologist. I did a BMUS and a BA at Melbourne before the Melbourne model came out. And I did a performance minor in early modern music. And music and poetry are really, really intertwined. And then decided that because they were so beautiful together, I started focusing more on poetry. And then basically just started reading as much as I possibly could about writing my own poetry, reading as much poetry as possible. But I'm also, again, if you want to ping me on Twitter, I'm happy to recommend some excellent anthologies that speak to people in really lovely, nurturing ways as to how to go about writing poems and experimenting with different forms, because the experimentation with form is something that is also evident in this game, except that it's obviously a lot more experimental rather than stuffy and formal.
I think that's like a thing that excites us both about.
Yeah.
Hi, up the back. Hi. Fantastic work. Clearly, you both need to be stopped. My question, I guess, is more to Gemma, I think. How do you decide what's what? Like, why is it an F sharp and not a key? Like, yeah.
Okay, so this is based on a very specific piano which we've nicknamed.
Show the picture.
Yeah, the haunted piano. So I've moved into a share house. It belongs to the person whose room I replaced. And at the moment, I've put in all the letters because I'm planning to write poems so the lines will most likely start with the notes. And also the notes, all of the notes have their own different characters because they're so grossly out of tune. There's just, some of them sound really, really good, but then there'll be one that will just, it's a shame we can't hear them because they just, oh my God, they're just ear-splitting. And so, yeah, I'm hopefully going to try and convey that once we start writing the poems for the haunted piano.
Just stop working. Yeah, it was working before. Like
Yeah.
when I was playing the piano.
Sorry, did that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I'll yell.
Yeah.
Like, can you imagine a version of this game where you like zoom out far enough and so it just says like space? I guess that's what I'm asking.
No, but me personally, no, because again, this is what Ian does. He makes things that just naturally inspire curiosity. It's like if someone just dumps you in a space, and then particularly with my experience of playing Catacombs, you just want to keep moving. You want to see what happens next.
Yeah, it's a cool idea though, like or just having like different words based on distance.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. Like, you know, as you far away from something, you just
I'm sorry. There won't really be space because there's just too many awesome things on Earth to kind of like micro search and write poems about.
One last question.
Oh gosh. I was super curious about your choices behind colour or lack thereof, and whether or not you're planning to do any formatting. I'm just curious about your overall thoughts.
Well, as I said, I quite like the fact that it's very disorientating, and I feel like, you know, if you made different objects, different colours, it would kind of make it easy to tell what's what. And so I kind of like that it all just looks like one page of text, and the text just flows into. So I think there are some like kind of little glitches, like some of the letters don't line up. Like I kind of maybe I want to make it like a little bit and line up a bit better, but that's just like a little glitch.
I kind of like the glitches.
Okay.
Yeah. No,
They kind of look like
yeah.
punctuation as well. So.
Yeah.
So like I'm pretty happy with the font.
Yeah,
It
no,
looks
I
like
love the
text,
font.
You know, it's just the text going. So, yeah.
Cool. Okay, that's all the time we have. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening.